May 7, 1945. The champagne was flowing in Paris. American soldiers were kissing French girls in the streets. Radios across the world were broadcasting the news that millions had been waiting for. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. But in a commandeered German mansion outside Frankfurt, there was no celebration. General George S. Patton sat across from Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower, and what he was about to say would destroy their friendship forever. It would get him removed from command within 4 months. It would make the media call him insane. And 50 years later, historians would realize he had been completely right. Patton leaned forward and said the words that Eisenhower had been dreading. "We're going to have to fight them eventually. Let's do it now while our army is intact, and we can win." He wasn't talking about the Germans. He was talking about the Soviet Union, America's ally, the heroic Red Army that newspapers praised every day. Uncle Joe Stalin, who President Roosevelt had called a friend. Patton wanted to attack them immediately. Eisenhower stared at his most aggressive general and felt his stomach tighten. He had spent 3 years carefully managing the alliance with Stalin. He had attended conferences where Roosevelt and Churchill made promises to the Soviet leader. He had coordinated military operations with Red Army commanders. The American public loved the Soviets. Hollywood was making movies about brave Russian soldiers. And now, Patton was proposing that they immediately turn around and attack their ally. The silence in that room lasted maybe 10 seconds. But in those 10 seconds, the future of the world was being decided. "George, you don't understand politics," Eisenhower finally said. "The war is over. The American people want their sons to come home. We can't just start another war." Patton looked at his commander and realized something that made his blood run cold. Eisenhower knew he was right. Eisenhower could see the same intelligence reports that Patton was seeing. He knew what the Soviets were doing in Eastern Europe. He understood the threat. But Eisenhower wasn't going to do anything about it, because Eisenhower cared more about his political future than strategic reality. That conversation was one of the most consequential moments in American military history. It was the moment when a general who correctly identified a massive threat was ignored by politicians who cared more about public opinion than protecting American interests. And over the next 50 years, everything Patton predicted would come true. The question we need to ask is simple. Was Patton right? Should America have attacked the Soviet Union in May 1945? And if he was right, why was he silenced? Let me show you what Patton was seeing that terrified him so much. Patton's Third Army had driven deeper into Germany than any other Allied force. His tanks had reached Czechoslovakia. His advance units were within striking distance of Berlin before Eisenhower ordered them to stop and let the Soviets take the city. And everywhere Patton went, he saw something that shocked even him. A man who had spent 4 years in combat. A general who had seen the worst of Nazi Germany. What he saw made the German atrocities look organized and civilized by comparison. The Red Army. Soviet forces were occupying Eastern Europe, and what they were doing was absolutely brutal. Patton's intelligence officers were filing reports that documented systematic rape on a scale that nobody in Washington wanted to believe. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of women. German women, Polish women, Hungarian women. Soviet soldiers were raping everything that moved. Officers either participated or looked the other way. When Patton's officers protested to their Soviet counterparts, they were told that the women deserved it. They were fascists. This was justice. Patton read these reports and felt sick. He had fought the Germans for years. He hated the Nazis. But what the Soviets were doing wasn't justice. It was organized barbarism. The rape was just the beginning. Soviet forces were systematically looting everything of value. They were stealing watches off people's wrists, taking wedding rings off women's fingers, loading trains with furniture, artwork, machinery, anything that could be moved. Entire factories were being dismantled and shipped back to Russia. Not just military factories, textile mills, food processing plants, businesses that had nothing to do with the German war effort. The Soviets were stripping Eastern Europe bare. But the worst part was what they were doing to people who had fought against the Nazis. In Poland, resistance fighters who had spent 6 years sabotaging German operations were being arrested by the NKVD. These were men and women who had risked their lives fighting Hitler, America's supposed allies. The Soviets rounded them up, called them fascist collaborators, and either shot them or shipped them to labor camps in Siberia. Patton met with some of these resistance leaders before the Soviets got them. They begged American forces for protection. They had fought for freedom. They thought the Americans would help them. Patton wanted to help them. Eisenhower ordered him not to interfere. It was Soviet territory now. Stay out of their business. Patton also met with liberated American prisoners of war who had been held by Soviet forces after being freed from German camps. What they told him was shocking. They said the Soviets treated them worse than the Germans had. Soviet soldiers stole their boots, took their rations. When American officers protested, they were beaten. Some were shot. One American officer told Patton that he had been held by the Germans for 2 years and treated according to Geneva Convention rules. Then Soviet forces liberated his camp. Within 24 hours, the Soviets had stolen everything the Americans had. When the senior American officer demanded to see a Soviet commander, he was knocked unconscious with a rifle butt. These were American soldiers, liberated by America's ally, and they were being treated like enemies. Patton wrote to his wife Beatrice in April 1945. The letter was personal, not meant for official channels, which is why he was brutally honest. I have no particular desire to understand them, meaning the Soviets, except to ascertain how much lead or iron it takes to kill them. The Russians give me the impression of something that is to be feared in future world political reorganization. He was seeing what Washington diplomats absolutely refused to see. The Soviet Union wasn't a temporary ally against Hitler. It wasn't going to become a peaceful democracy after the war. It was a totalitarian empire that was expanding westward, and American politicians were helping them do it. While politicians in Washington naively believed Stalin would honor his agreements about free elections and democratic governance, Patton was watching the reality on the ground. In Poland, the Soviets had promised at the Yalta Conference that there would be free elections. That promise lasted about 6 weeks. By June 1945, the NKVD had arrested every significant non-communist political leader in Poland. The promised elections never happened. Instead, the Soviets installed a puppet government made up of Polish communists who had spent the war in Moscow. When Patton's intelligence officers reported this, Washington told them they must be mistaken. Stalin had personally promised Roosevelt that Poland would be free. In Romania, the same thing was happening. In Hungary, the same thing. In Bulgaria, the same thing. The pattern was obvious to anyone who was willing to see it. The Soviets would promise elections. Then they would arrest opposition leaders. Then they would install communist governments. Then they would declare that the people had freely chosen communism. It was a script, and they were following it in every country they occupied. Patton saw this and understood exactly what it meant. The Soviet Union was creating an empire in Eastern Europe. They had no intention of leaving. They had no intention of allowing democracy. Every promise Stalin made at Yalta was worthless, and American forces that could have stopped this were being ordered to stand down and let it happen. By May 1945, Patton wasn't just angry. He had developed a detailed military plan. This wasn't just emotional rhetoric from a frustrated general. It was a legitimate strategic assessment based on real intelligence about Soviet capabilities and American advantages. Patton's analysis was straightforward. The Red Army had just lost 27 million people defeating Germany. That's not a typo. 27 million Soviet soldiers and civilians dead. The Red Army in Eastern Europe was exhausted. Soviet forces were living off captured German supplies. Their supply lines stretched thousands of miles back to Russia through territory that had been devastated by 4 years of warfare. Soviet equipment was falling apart. Their tanks had mechanical problems. Their trucks were breaking down. Their soldiers were tired and wanted to go home. American forces, by contrast, were at peak strength. Patton's Third Army alone had over 400,000 men. They were well supplied, well equipped, and they had just spent a year driving across Europe and winning every major engagement they fought. American air superiority was total. The Soviets had no strategic bombing capability. They had minimal anti-aircraft defenses. American bombers could destroy Soviet supply lines at will. "We could beat the Russians in 6 weeks," Patton told Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson in May 1945. 6 weeks. Patton wasn't just guessing. His intelligence staff had been studying Soviet dispositions. They knew where Soviet forces were concentrated. They knew where Soviet supply depots were located. They knew Soviet weaknesses. The plan was actually feasible from a purely military standpoint. Patton proposed that American forces, reinforced by British units, would launch a surprise offensive driving east from Germany. The immediate objective would be to liberate Poland and Czechoslovakia. American armor would cut Soviet supply lines. American air power would destroy Soviet logistics. Soviet forces, exhausted and demoralized, would either retreat or surrender. Most importantly, Patton argued that Soviet morale was fragile. Soviet soldiers had been told they were fighting to liberate their homeland from German invasion. Many of them had no interest in occupying Poland or Germany permanently. They wanted to go home. If American forces pushed east, Patton believed significant numbers of Soviet soldiers would simply surrender. They'd fought the Germans for 4 years. They didn't want to fight the Americans. But here's where Patton's plan became really controversial. He proposed rearming German units to fight alongside American forces. There were hundreds of thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers sitting in prisoner-of-war camps. They had just surrendered. Many of them were terrified of Soviet revenge. Patton's idea was simple and brutal. Offer them a choice. Sit in a POW camp for years, or join American forces fighting eastward against the Soviets. Patton believed thousands would volunteer. German soldiers hated and feared the Soviets more than they hated Americans. The Eastern Front had been a war of annihilation. Germans knew what would happen to them if the Soviets captured them. "I would rather have a German division on my side than a Soviet one," Patton told his staff. This comment was leaked to the press within weeks, and the reaction was explosive. The United States had just spent 4 years defeating Germany. American soldiers had died fighting the Wehrmacht. American families had made sacrifices to beat the Nazis. And now Patton was proposing to rearm German soldiers, to make them American allies? It sounded insane. It sounded like Patton had lost his mind. But Patton's logic was brutal and clear. The war against Germany was over. Germany was defeated. The threat now was Soviet expansion. Using German soldiers to fight the Soviets made perfect strategic sense, even if it was politically impossible. This gets to the core of why Patton's plan was rejected. It wasn't rejected because it wouldn't work militarily. It was rejected because it was politically unacceptable. Eisenhower had military reasons for rejecting Patton's plan. American forces were positioned to occupy Germany, not to push east into Poland. American supply lines ran west to France, not east into Soviet-occupied territory. Logistically, launching an offensive into Eastern Europe would have been complicated. But these weren't the real reasons Eisenhower said no. The real reasons were political. President Truman had just taken office after Roosevelt's death in April 1945. Truman was continuing Roosevelt's policy of cooperation with Stalin. The Yalta Conference had established the framework for post-war Europe. The United Nations was being organized on the principle that the United States and Soviet Union would cooperate to maintain peace. Eisenhower knew that proposing an attack on the Soviet Union would be career suicide. He would be accused of warmongering, of risking World War III, of betraying America's ally. The media would destroy him. Congress would remove him from command. The American public, exhausted after 4 years of war, would turn against him. More personally, Eisenhower liked being the hero. He had just won the war in Europe. Newspapers were calling him the greatest military commander since Ulysses S. Grant. Both political parties were already discussing him as a potential presidential candidate. Why would he risk that reputation by supporting Patton's crazy plan to attack the Soviets? Eisenhower also genuinely believed in the diplomatic solution. He thought Stalin could be negotiated with. He thought the Soviet Union would moderate once post-war tensions eased. He believed the United Nations could manage disputes between the superpowers. This was the fundamental difference between Eisenhower and Patton. Eisenhower believed in institutions, diplomacy, and political process. Patton believed in military force and strategic opportunity. Eisenhower thought like a future politician. Patton thought like a warrior. George sees the world as a battlefield, Eisenhower told his chief of staff. He doesn't understand that we have to live with these people. But Patton's response would have been simple. Yes, we have to live with them. But on what terms? Do we live with them while they enslave Eastern Europe? Do we live with them while they spread communism globally? Do we live with them while they build up military power that will threaten us for decades? Patton's argument was that May 1945 was a unique window of opportunity. The Red Army was weak. American forces were strong. Waiting would only make the problem worse. Every month that passed, Soviet forces would recover. They would consolidate control over Eastern Europe. They would rebuild their military. The opportunity to act would close. Fight them now, Patton argued, or fight them later under much worse conditions. Eisenhower rejected this argument. He rejected Patton's plan, and he wasn't going to debate it. George, the decision has been made, Eisenhower told Patton at that meeting in May 1945. We're not attacking the Soviets. We're going to work with them. Drop it. But Patton couldn't drop it. Because everywhere he looked, he saw evidence that he was right. Patton wasn't alone in his assessment. Winston Churchill had reached exactly the same conclusion. Churchill had been warning about Soviet intentions since the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. He had only allied with the Soviet Union out of desperate necessity when Hitler invaded Russia. But by April 1945, Churchill was frantically sending messages to Truman and Eisenhower. He wanted Western forces to push as far east as possible before the Soviets consolidated control. He wanted to take Berlin, Prague, and Vienna before the Red Army arrived. Churchill could see what was coming. An iron curtain is drawn down upon their front, Churchill wrote to Truman on May 12, 1945. This was the first time Churchill used the phrase that would define the Cold War. We do not know what is going on behind. Churchill wasn't content with just writing letters. In May 1945, he ordered British military planners to develop a detailed strategy for an Allied offensive against Soviet forces in Eastern Europe. The plan was codenamed Operation Unthinkable, and it was remarkably similar to what Patton was proposing. Operation Unthinkable assumed American and British forces, reinforced by rearmed German units, would launch a surprise offensive to push Soviet forces out of Poland. The British Chiefs of Staff analyzed Operation Unthinkable and concluded it was militarily feasible if launched immediately in summer 1945. They estimated that Allied forces could defeat Soviet forces in Eastern Europe within several months. They warned it would require total commitment. There could be no half measures. But the operational concept was sound. Churchill sent Operation Unthinkable to Truman in June 1945. Truman's reaction was horror. He rejected it immediately. He was horrified by the suggestion of attacking the Soviet Union. He was even more horrified by the proposal to rearm German units to fight alongside American forces. Truman ordered all copies of Operation Unthinkable to be classified. The plan was buried. Churchill was told in no uncertain terms that the United States would not support any military action against the Soviet Union. When Patton learned that Churchill had proposed essentially the same strategy he had been advocating, he felt vindicated. "At least one man in power understands what we're facing," Patton told his staff. But it didn't matter. Churchill was being pushed out of power. In July 1945, British voters rejected Churchill in a landslide election. The Labour Party won, and Clement Attlee became Prime Minister. Attlee had no interest in confronting the Soviets. Churchill's warnings were ignored. Operation Unthinkable was classified and forgotten. And within 18 months, Churchill's prediction about Soviet intentions proved absolutely accurate. But by then, it was too late to do anything about it. The Iron Curtain had fallen. Soviet control of Eastern Europe was permanent. The Cold War had begun. And the opportunity that Patton and Churchill had identified in May 1945 was gone forever. The press had loved Patton during the war. He was great copy. The aggressive general with the pearl-handled revolvers, the man who slapped shell-shocked soldiers and told them to get back to fighting. The tank commander who drove deeper into Germany than anyone thought possible. But in May and June 1945, the coverage changed. Someone was leaking Patton's comments about the Soviets to journalists. His proposal to rearm German units was characterized as Nazi sympathizing. Columnists started questioning his mental stability. Drew Pearson, one of the most influential journalists in America, wrote in June 1945 that General Patton's recent statements about the Soviet Union raised serious questions about his judgment. At a time when the nation seeks peace, Patton seems intent on starting another war. The New York Times editorial board wrote that Patton's political statements suggest a troubling lack of understanding of diplomatic realities. Time magazine questioned whether his aggressive personality was suited for peacetime leadership. The narrative was being established. Patton was a great combat commander who couldn't adjust to peacetime. He was a warrior who didn't understand politics. He was brilliant on the battlefield, but dangerous in diplomacy. None of these outlets reported what Patton was actually observing in Eastern Europe. None investigated the Soviet atrocities that Patton's intelligence officers were documenting. The mass rapes, the systematic looting, the arrests of resistance fighters, the installation of puppet governments. None of that made it into American newspapers, because American newspapers didn't want to report bad news about America's ally. The media narrative was that the Soviets were heroic liberators. Uncle Joe Stalin was a friend. The Red Army had saved Europe from fascism. Reporting that Soviet soldiers were raping their way across Eastern Europe didn't fit that narrative. So it wasn't reported. Patton saw this and realized something disturbing. The American media was helping cover up Soviet atrocities. Whether intentionally or not, American journalists were spreading Soviet propaganda by refusing to report the truth about what was happening in Eastern Europe. By August 1945, Eisenhower was receiving enormous pressure from Washington to remove Patton from command. The excuse came from denazification policy. The Allied occupation of Germany required that all former Nazi Party members be removed from administrative positions. This was supposed to cleanse Germany of Nazi influence. In practice, it was creating chaos. Patton pointed out at a press conference in September 1945 that requiring all former Nazi Party members to be removed from administrative positions was idiotic. Many Germans had joined the Nazi Party for pragmatic reasons, not ideological commitment. They joined because it was required for their jobs. Removing all of them meant there was nobody left to run basic government services. "This Nazi thing," Patton said at the press conference, "is just like a Democrat and Republican election fight." The comment was reported as Patton minimizing Nazi atrocities. The reaction was explosive. Jewish organizations condemned Patton. Veterans groups demanded his removal. Editorial boards called for Eisenhower to fire him immediately. On September 28, 1945, Eisenhower relieved Patton of command of the Third Army. The official reason was his denazification comments and his inability to follow occupation policy. But everyone understood the real reason. Patton wouldn't stop warning about the Soviets. He wouldn't stop saying that America needed to confront Soviet expansion militarily. He wouldn't shut up and go along with the official narrative. So Eisenhower removed him from command and reassigned him to a meaningless administrative position overseeing the history of the Third Army's campaigns. It was a humiliating demotion for one of the most successful generals in American history. Patton had commanded armies in combat for 3 years. He had liberated France. He had driven into Germany. He had won every major battle he fought. And now he was being put behind a desk to write reports. The message was clear. This is what happens to generals who question political decisions. After being removed from command, Patton spent his final months writing. He wrote desperate warnings to anyone in Washington who would listen. His letters from October and November 1945 read like prophecies. "Let's keep our boots polished, bayonets sharpened, and present a picture of force and strength to the Red Army," Patton wrote in October 1945. "This is the only language they understand and respect. If you fail to do this, then I say that we have had a victory over the Germans and disarmed them, but we have lost the war." He predicted that the Soviets would maintain permanent occupation of Eastern Europe. He predicted they would spread communism through Western Europe using political subversion and military intimidation. He predicted that military confrontation with the Soviet Union was inevitable, and that waiting would only make it worse. "We're going to fight them eventually," Patton wrote, "in 5 years, or 10 years, or 20 years. And when we do, we'll wish we had done it in 1945 when we had the chance." Nobody in Washington wanted to hear this. The American public was exhausted from war. Soldiers were being demobilized as fast as possible. Congress was cutting military budgets. The mood in America was celebration and relief, not preparation for another conflict. Patton's warnings were politically toxic. Any politician who endorsed them would be accused of warmongering. So Patton's letters were filed away and ignored. In early December 1945, Patton met with Undersecretary of War Robert Patterson. It was one of his last official meetings. Patton gave Patterson a detailed assessment of Soviet intentions and capabilities. He predicted permanent Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe. He predicted Soviet support for communist movements in Western Europe. He predicted that military confrontation would become necessary within a decade. He urged Patterson to maintain American military strength in Europe as a deterrent. Patterson listened politely and thanked Patton for his analysis. Then Patterson told Patton that Washington had no interest in confrontation with the Soviet Union. The American public wanted peace. Patton's warnings were politically impossible to act on. The meeting ended. Patton left, feeling defeated. 3 days later, on December 9, 1945, Patton was critically injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His staff car was struck by an army truck. The collision wasn't severe. Other passengers walked away with minor injuries. But Patton's neck was broken. He was paralyzed from the neck down. He was taken to a military hospital where doctors determined that his injuries were permanent. He would never walk again. He would never recover. Patton died on December 21, 1945, 12 days after the accident. He was 60 years old. The timing of the accident fueled immediate conspiracy theories. Patton had just submitted his assessment about the Soviet threat 3 days before the accident. He had been warning about Soviet expansion for months. He had made powerful enemies in Washington and Moscow. The truck driver's explanation for the accident seemed implausible. He claimed he didn't see Patton's staff car, even though visibility was good. The fact that Patton was the only person seriously injured seemed suspicious. Was it really an accident? Or was Patton assassinated to silence his warnings about the Soviet Union? There's no credible evidence that Patton was assassinated. Investigations at the time found no evidence of foul play. The driver passed lie detector tests. The most likely explanation is that it was just a tragic accident. A moment of inattention that killed one of America's greatest generals. But the conspiracy theories persist, because the timing was so convenient for everyone who wanted Patton silenced. Whether it was an accident or assassination, the result was the same. The one general who had been loudly warning about the Soviet threat was dead. His voice was silenced permanently, and everything he predicted came true. By 1946, Soviet forces had consolidated control over Poland, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and Bulgaria. The free elections promised at Yalta never happened. In Poland, the Soviets arrested resistance leaders who had fought the Nazis for 6 years. Leaders like Witold Pilecki, who had voluntarily entered Auschwitz to gather intelligence and then escaped to fight in the Warsaw Uprising. Pilecki was arrested by the NKVD in 1947, tortured, given a show trial, and executed as a Western spy. Thousands of other Polish resistance fighters met the same fate. They fought Hitler for 6 years, and they were murdered by Stalin. In Czechoslovakia, there was a brief hope for democracy. Elections in 1946 gave Democratic parties a majority. But in February 1948, Communist forces staged a coup with Soviet backing. The Democratic government was overthrown. Opposition leaders were arrested. Foreign Minister Jan Masaryk, who had worked for Czech democracy, died in a fall from his office window. The Communists ruled it suicide. Everyone knew it was murder. The pattern repeated across Eastern Europe. Soviet occupation, communist governments, elimination of opposition, show trials, executions, labor camps. Between 1945 and 1989, communist regimes in Eastern Europe killed approximately 1 million people. That's a conservative estimate. Millions more were imprisoned, tortured, or exiled. The Iron Curtain that Churchill warned about became permanent. It divided Europe for 45 years. Families were separated, countries were imprisoned, freedom was crushed. And it all could have been prevented in May 1945 if Patton's warnings had been heeded. The Cold War lasted 45 years. It cost trillions of dollars. American forces fought in Korea, losing over 36,000 dead. American forces fought in Vietnam, losing over 58,000 dead. Proxy wars in Afghanistan, Angola, Central America killed hundreds of thousands more. The nuclear arms race brought the world to the brink of annihilation multiple times. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 came within hours of nuclear war. All of this was the Cold War that Patton wanted to prevent in 1945. By 1949, the Soviets had atomic weapons. By 1950, confronting communist expansion required the Korean War. Patton's argument had been that May 1945 was the moment to act, while the Red Army was exhausted and American forces were at peak strength. He was right about the window of opportunity. Whether military action would have succeeded is debatable. Whether it was politically possible is not. It wasn't politically possible. But every scenario Patton predicted came true. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe was permanent. Communist expansion continued for decades. Military confrontation proved necessary. The only question was timing and scope. Patton argued for confronting the threat when it was weakest. American policy was to wait until the threat was much stronger. Which approach was wiser is a question every person needs to answer for themselves. For decades after Patton's death, his warnings were vindicated by events. Every prediction he made came true. Every policy he opposed proved disastrous. By 1947, even liberals who had supported Roosevelt's policy of cooperation with Stalin had to acknowledge the failure. George Kennan, an American diplomat in Moscow, sent what became known as the Long Telegram in February 1946. Kennan described Soviet expansionism in terms that echoed Patton's 1945 warnings almost word for word. The Soviets, Kennan wrote, are committed to the belief that there can be no permanent coexistence with the West. They will use every means to expand their power. They respect only force. Kennan's telegram became the basis for the Truman Doctrine announced in March 1947. The United States committed to containing Soviet expansion, but containment meant accepting Soviet control of Eastern Europe as permanent. It meant fighting limited wars in Korea and Vietnam to stop further communist expansion. It meant 45 years of Cold War that Patton believed could have been avoided. Conservative critics began citing Patton as a prophet who had seen the truth while politicians chose appeasement. Douglas MacArthur, who faced similar conflicts with Truman during the Korean War, wrote in his memoirs that Patton understood that communism had to be confronted militarily. His removal from command was a tragedy for which we are still paying the price. Ronald Reagan cited Patton's warnings during his 1980 presidential campaign. Reagan advocated for military strength and confrontation with what he called the evil empire. Reagan's rhetoric about the Soviet Union was strikingly similar to Patton's language from 1945. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, conservatives argued that Reagan's policy of strength rather than accommodation had vindicated Patton's 1945 assessment. The Soviet Union, they argued, had always been vulnerable to military and economic pressure. Waiting 45 years to apply that pressure had been unnecessary. If Patton had been listened to, Eastern Europe might have been liberated in 1945 instead of 1989. 45 years of communist tyranny might have been prevented. Millions of lives might have been saved. This is the conservative interpretation of Patton's legacy. The liberal interpretation is very different. Liberal historians argue that attacking the Soviet Union in 1945 would have been a catastrophic mistake. The Red Army, even exhausted, was still enormous. American forces were tired and wanted to go home. A war against the Soviet Union could have lasted years and cost hundreds of thousands of American lives. The use of atomic weapons might have been necessary. The destruction would have been immense. Moreover, liberals argue the Cold War, as terrible as it was, never became a hot war between the superpowers. Nuclear weapons made both sides cautious. The policy of containment eventually worked. The Soviet Union collapsed from internal contradictions without a major war. Attacking in 1945 might have led to World War III. From this perspective, Eisenhower was right to reject Patton's plan. The political and military risks were too high. Diplomacy and containment were the wiser course. Who was right? That's not a question with an easy answer. What we can say with certainty is that Patton correctly identified the Soviet threat before most American leaders would acknowledge it. He proposed a military solution when one was theoretically possible, and he was silenced for having the courage to speak uncomfortable truths. The question of whether Patton was right in 1945 isn't just historical curiosity. It speaks to fundamental questions about American strategy that remain absolutely relevant today. When should the United States confront emerging threats militarily rather than diplomatically? Should military leaders advocate for what they believe is strategically necessary, even if it's politically impossible? How do you balance military effectiveness with political reality? These questions arose with Patton in 1945, and they recur in every generation. After September 11th, debates about confronting terrorism echoed the Patton debate. Some argued for aggressive military action to destroy terrorist organizations and the states that supported them. Others argued for a more measured approach using intelligence and diplomacy. The Iraq War became a test case. Those who supported the invasion argued that threats should be confronted before they become catastrophic. Those who opposed it argued that military action created more problems than it solved. The debate was essentially the same debate Eisenhower and Patton had in 1945. With China's rise as a military and economic power, similar questions are emerging today. Should America confront Chinese expansion now, while American power is relatively greater? Or should America pursue diplomatic engagement and hope that economic integration moderates Chinese behavior? There are military officers today making arguments very similar to Patton's 1945 warnings. They argue that China is a strategic threat that will only grow stronger. They argue that the window for effective military action is closing. They argue that waiting makes confrontation more costly. And there are political leaders responding very much like Eisenhower did. They argue that war with China would be catastrophic. They argue that diplomacy and economic ties can manage the relationship. They argue that military confrontation should be a last resort. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. The Patton-Eisenhower debate is being replayed with different actors and different threats. Patton's perspective, the warrior's perspective, is that threats should be destroyed when they're vulnerable rather than managed until they're dangerous. This perspective has merit. There are historical examples where early military action prevented worse conflicts later. But there are also examples where military action created disasters that diplomacy might have avoided. The diplomat's perspective, Eisenhower's perspective, is that most conflicts can be resolved through negotiation, and that military force should be reserved for truly existential threats. This perspective also has merit. Diplomacy has resolved many conflicts that could have become wars, but there are also examples where diplomatic delay allowed threats to grow until military confrontation became inevitable under much worse conditions. The question every generation faces is, which perspective is correct for the specific threat at that specific moment? Sometimes the warrior is right. Sometimes the diplomat is right. The tragedy is that you often don't know which one was right until decades later, when it's too late to change course. Patton's removal from command can be seen from two perspectives. From one perspective, the system worked correctly. A general who wouldn't accept civilian authority and who was publicly criticizing government policy was removed from command. In a democracy, the military must be subordinate to civilian leadership. Generals don't make foreign policy. Politicians do. Patton was crossing that line repeatedly. He was publicly advocating for war with the Soviet Union against the policy of his commander and his president. He had to be removed. That's how civilian control of the military works. From another perspective, the system failed catastrophically. A general who correctly identified a strategic threat was silenced for political reasons. Patton had better intelligence and better strategic analysis than the politicians making decisions in Washington. He understood what the Soviets were doing in Eastern Europe because he was there seeing it firsthand. Politicians in Washington were operating on naive assumptions about Soviet intentions. Patton tried to warn them. He tried to provide accurate intelligence about what was really happening. And instead of listening to him, they removed him from command to shut him up. That's not civilian control. That's political cowardice. Both interpretations have validity. The question is, which principle matters more? Should generals who see threats that politicians want to ignore stay silent? Or should they speak out regardless of consequences? Patton's answer was clear. A general's duty is to provide accurate assessments and honest recommendations, even if those recommendations are politically unacceptable. If the politicians reject the recommendations, that's their choice. But the general must speak the truth. Patton believed that staying silent when you see a strategic threat is dereliction of duty. He paid for that belief with his career and possibly his life. But he ensured that when history vindicated his warnings, his voice would be remembered. The next generation of military leaders will face similar dilemmas. When generals see threats that politicians want to ignore, what should they do? The safe career move is to stay silent. Keep your head down. Don't make waves. Wait for the politicians to figure it out on their own. That's what most generals do. But is it the right thing to do? Or is the right thing to do what Patton did? Speak the truth. Give your honest assessment. Push back against bad policy, even if it costs you your career. That's a question every military officer has to answer for themselves. There's no easy answer. But Patton provides an example of what it looks like to choose truth over career. Eisenhower's refusal to support Patton revealed something fundamental about how he understood leadership. Eisenhower's genius during World War II was holding together the Allied coalition. Getting Americans, British, and Soviets to work together toward a common goal was an enormous diplomatic achievement. Eisenhower was brilliant at managing relationships, smoothing over conflicts, and finding compromises that kept the alliance functioning. But this talent came with a limitation. Eisenhower was psychologically invested in the idea that the alliance could work. He had spent 3 years building relationships with Soviet commanders. He had convinced himself that the Soviets, despite their flaws, were ultimately partners in creating a peaceful post-war order. Patton was telling him that everything he had built was based on a lie, that the Soviets were enemies, not partners, that the alliance was worthless because one member was planning to betray the others. This contradicted everything Eisenhower had invested his career in. Accepting Patton's argument would have meant admitting that Eisenhower had been wrong about the Soviets, that he had misjudged Stalin, that his diplomatic efforts had been naive. Eisenhower couldn't accept that. So he rejected Patton's warnings not because they were wrong, but because accepting them was psychologically impossible. Eisenhower also cared deeply about his reputation. By May 1945, he was being discussed as a potential presidential candidate by both parties. He was the hero who won the war, the general who brought the boys home. Supporting an attack on the Soviets would have destroyed that reputation instantly. The media would have called him a warmonger. The public would have turned against him. His political future would have been over. Eisenhower chose the politically safe path. He rejected Patton's plan. He removed Patton from command when Patton wouldn't stop talking. And he pursued cooperation with Stalin, even as evidence mounted that Stalin was betraying every agreement they had made. From a political perspective, Eisenhower's choice was understandable. He protected his reputation. He eventually became president. His career was a success. From a strategic perspective, Eisenhower's choice was a disaster. The Soviet threat that Patton identified in 1945 wasn't confronted until it had grown much stronger. The Cold War that might have been prevented lasted 45 years. Eastern Europe, that might have been liberated in 1945, remained under communist tyranny until 1989. Millions of people who might have been saved died under communist regimes. This was Eisenhower's limitation. He was brilliant at managing coalitions and understanding political reality, but he couldn't see beyond immediate political constraints to long-term strategic consequences. Patton could. Patton didn't care about political reality or his post-war career. He cared about identifying threats and destroying them while the opportunity existed. Who was the better leader? The answer depends on what you think leadership means. If leadership means building consensus, managing relationships, and achieving political success, then Eisenhower was the better leader. If leadership means seeing threats clearly, speaking truth regardless of consequences, and prioritizing strategic interests over political convenience, then Patton was the better leader. History needed both men, but history also suggests that sometimes the warrior's judgment is better than the diplomat's. George S. Patton died on December 21, 1945, at age 60, paralyzed in a hospital bed in Heidelberg, Germany. He had requested that if he died in Europe, he wanted to be buried at the American Military Cemetery in Luxembourg, alongside soldiers of the Third Army. His request was honored. Thousands of soldiers he had commanded attended his funeral. He was buried in a military cemetery on a hillside overlooking the city of Luxembourg. His grave is marked by a simple white cross, identical to the crosses marking the graves of the soldiers buried around him. Patton had said he wanted to be buried among his soldiers, not separated from them as officers usually were. Even in death, he was one of them. In the decades after his death, Patton became a symbol. To conservatives, he represented the warrior who saw threats clearly and advocated strength over appeasement. To liberals, he represented the dangerous militarist who preferred war to diplomacy. To the American public, he remained the brilliant tank commander with the pearl-handled revolvers who helped win World War II. The question of whether Patton was right about the Soviet Union was answered definitively by subsequent events. Everything he predicted came true. Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe, communist expansion globally, the Cold War that lasted decades, the millions who died under communist tyranny. All of it happened exactly as Patton warned it would. Whether his proposed solution would have worked is unknowable. Whether it should have been attempted is debatable. But that he correctly identified the threat before most American leaders would acknowledge it is undeniable. Patton's tragedy was being right at the wrong moment. He saw in 1945 what others wouldn't acknowledge until 1947 or later. He proposed action when it might have succeeded. He was silenced before he could be vindicated. He died before he could say, "I told you so." The generation of American leaders who rejected Patton's warnings went on to fight the Cold War he wanted to prevent. They spent 45 years and trillions of dollars containing Soviet power that might have been broken in 1945. Whether they made the right choice is a question each person must answer based on their own judgment. But that they made a choice with enormous consequences is beyond dispute. Patton's voice echoes across the decades as a reminder of certain uncomfortable truths about strategy and leadership. Sometimes the prophet is dismissed. Sometimes the truth-teller is silenced. Sometimes the warrior who sees clearly is removed from command by politicians who prefer comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. The lesson isn't necessarily that the United States should have attacked the Soviet Union in 1945. Reasonable people can disagree about whether that would have been wise. The lesson is broader and more important. Strategic threats should be confronted when they're vulnerable rather than managed until they become dangerous. Political constraints should inform military strategy, but not determine it. And generals who tell the truth should be heard even when their message is unwelcome. These lessons were learned at enormous cost over the half-century that followed Patton's death. They may need to be learned again, because the fundamental tension between the warrior's perspective and the diplomat's perspective hasn't gone away. That tension exists in every administration, in every National Security Council meeting, in every strategic decision. Sometimes the warrior is right and action is necessary. Sometimes the diplomat is right and patience is wiser. The question is always which one is correct for that specific threat at that specific moment. Patton believed military leaders have a duty to provide their honest assessment even when that assessment is politically unacceptable. That duty doesn't end when politicians disagree. It doesn't end when the media criticizes. It doesn't end when speaking the truth costs your career. Patton spoke the truth about the Soviet Union in 1945. He lost his command. He was humiliated in the press. He died 3 months later. But 75 years later, everyone acknowledges he was right. Everyone acknowledges that the policies he opposed were disasters. Everyone acknowledges that the warnings he gave should have been heeded. That vindication came too late to save Eastern Europe from communist tyranny. It came too late to prevent the Cold War. It came too late to save the millions who died under Soviet occupation. But it validates the principle that Patton lived by, that speaking the truth matters even when nobody wants to hear it, that strategic analysis matters more than political convenience, that sometimes the warrior sees what the politician refuses to acknowledge. If you found this story valuable, let me know in the comments what you think. Should Eisenhower have listened to Patton? Was attacking the Soviet Union in 1945 the right strategic move? These are questions worth debating because they're still relevant today. And if you want more forgotten stories from World War II that changed history, make sure you're subscribed because there are dozens more to tell. Hit that like button if this story made you think differently about the Cold War. Share it with anyone who's interested in military history or strategic decision-making. Because Patton's warning wasn't just about 1945, it's about every moment when leaders have to choose between what's politically convenient and what's strategically necessary. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one.